The sirens that night didn't just wail, they felt like a predator's cry echoing through the sterile concrete canyons of the medical district, a sharp, rhythmic terror that matched the frantic hammering in Alyssa's chest. At 28, she was exhausted, overlooked, and bone-deep terrified, the kind of adrenaline-soaked fatigue that settles in after 12 hours of saving lives, only to realize your own is now the one being hunted. Bursting through the heavy glass doors of the Grand Meridian Hotel to escape the black sedan trailing her, Alyssa's world tilted. Her navy scrubs were rumpled and damp with the sweat of a woman who had seen too much in the ER's shadows. She scanned the lobby for a shield, a witness, a miracle, and her eyes locked onto the only man who looked like he owned the silence. Alyssa didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her hands shaking as they gripped the lapels of a perfectly tailored black suit that looked like it cost more than her medical degree. She leaned in, invading his personal space out of sheer necessity, her breath hitching as she whispered a plea for him to be her last refuge. The lobby was bustling. People were watching. The smart thing, the survival thing, was for the man to push her away and call security. But the stranger stood completely still, his hands relaxed at his sides, watching her with a controlled, unreadable assessment. He didn't flinch at her desperation. He allowed her grip, signaling a dominant power that made the sirens outside feel suddenly small. Alyssa looked into his lowered eyes, pleading with a man who looked like he had faced worse danger than whatever was chasing her through the glass doors. She clutched the note containing the evidence of the syndicate's fraud in her pocket, a death sentence for her career, and prayed this stranger was the miracle she needed. She was unaware that she had just sought safety in the arms of the most dangerous man the city's monsters feared to name. She didn't see the watchful figure in the background, a man who understood exactly that the nurse had just handed her fate to a king of the underworld. The fluorescent lights of the St. Jude's ER didn't hum. They buzzed with a clinical, predatory energy that usually signaled a long night of trauma and triage. Alyssa Moore moved through the chaos with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent years being the calm at the center of the storm. At 2 a.m., the ER was a graveyard of broken things and forgotten people, a place where Alyssa's survival depended on her being a dedicated, invisible savior. She was restocking the supply cabinet in the high-security wing when she heard the voices, low, urgent, and devoid of the empathy usually found in a place of healing. It was Dr. Sterling, the chief of medicine, and a man whose expensive suit looked like a stain against the sterile white tiles. They weren't discussing patient outcomes, they were discussing units and disposables. Curiosity, that dangerous edge of her savior complex, forced Alyssa to linger in the shadows. When they moved toward the administrator's office, they left a discarded digital tablet on a gurney. Alyssa swiped it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird as she scrolled through the open files. It wasn't medical data. It was a high-level medical insurance fraud log. Thousands of patients, the city's most vulnerable, were being billed for surgeries they never had, while the black market medical supplies were being diverted to a dangerous local syndicate. Alyssa's breath hitched. This wasn't just corruption. It was a harvest. The sound of returning footsteps made her world tilt. She scrambled to hide the tablet in her navy scrubs, her hands shaking as she tried to maintain the mask of an understated professional nurse. But she had been seen. Dr. Sterling's eyes, usually sharp and clinical, turned weaponized and cold as they locked onto her. "Nurse Moore," he said, his voice a low-frequency hum of skepticism. "You're off your station." Alyssa didn't wait for the accusation. She didn't stay for the explanation. She turned and ran. She sprinted past the triage desk, the sirens of incoming ambulances mirroring the scream building in her throat. She burst through the hospital's service exit, the cold night air hitting her damp scrubs like a jagged blade. The hunt had begun. Behind her, the heavy click of doors and the screech of tires told her the cleaners were already mobilized. She was a whistleblower in rumpled scrubs, carrying a death sentence in her pocket, fleeing through a city that suddenly felt like a hunting ground. She was exhausted, terrified, and bone-deep lonely, looking for any stranger who could offer her a miracle before the shadows caught up. The black sedan moved through the rain-slicked streets with the silent, surgical precision of a shadow. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the cold, in terrifying stillness of the man beside her. Alyssa sat huddled in the back seat, her fingers digging into the fabric of her navy scrubs as she watched the hotel lobby vanish into the mist. Seo-jun didn't speak. He simply stared out the window, his profile as sharp and unyielding as a blade. They arrived at a fortress of glass and steel that loomed over the city's edge, a monolithic structure that screamed of absolute, untouchable power. The enforcer in the background, the silent shadow who had watched them at the hotel, opened the door with a robotic efficiency. Alyssa was led through a minimalist foyer where the white marble floors felt like ice beneath her feet. Seo-jun led her into a high-ceilinged study, a blue-hued cavern of floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic view of the city she was currently fleeing. He turned to face her, his perfectly tailored suit appearing untouched by the chaos of the night. He stood completely still, his hands relaxed at his sides, watching her with the terrifying patience of a predator who had already won. "In my world, people only run to me when they are already dead," Seo-jun said, his voice smooth, low, and devoid of the warmth she had hoped for. He took a step toward her, invading her personal space, just as she had invaded his in the lobby. "You are an ER nurse. You have spent your shift saving lives, and now you are begging a monster to save yours." Alyssa's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she looked into his lowered, unreadable eyes. She reached into her damp scrubs and pulled out the crumpled note containing the evidence of the insurance fraud. Her hands shook violently, nor her expression a mix of fear and the desperate determination of a woman with no other option. "I saw something I wasn't supposed to," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the air conditioning. "They're killing people for profit, and now they want me erased?" Seo-jun took the note, his gaze flickering over the jagged handwriting before returning to her face. He didn't offer comfort or a promise of safety. He simply studied her, dissecting her vulnerability to find the steel spine he suspected was hidden beneath the rumpled scrubs. "You didn't just witness a crime, Alyssa," he said, his voice dropping to a glacial chill that made the hair on her arms stand up. "You stole a secret from the very men who believe they own this city." He leaned in, his face calm and emotionless. "Tell me everything. Because if you lie to a monster, the devils behind you will be the least of your concerns." Alyssa swallowed the lump in her throat, realizing that the safe house was just another kind of cage. But as she looked at Seo-jun's controlled, dominant presence, she knew she had traded her life for a chance to fight back. The blue-hued glow of the television screen in Seo-jun's study felt like a second skin, one that Alyssa desperately wanted to shed. She stood before the glass wall, her scrubs still slightly rumpled, watching the morning news broadcast flicker into life. The anchor's voice was professional, yet it carried the jagged weight of a death sentence. St. Jude's Hospital had issued an official statement. Nurse Alyssa Moore was being sought for questioning in connection with a fatal medication error. The administration didn't just want her gone, they were erasing the very foundation of her soul. Dr. Sterling appeared on screen, his face a mask of practiced clinical grief. He spoke of concerning behavioral shifts, citing a history of mental instability and exhaustion that had culminated in the tragic death of a patient under her care. In 30 seconds, the system she had sacrificed her life to serve had transformed her from a dedicated savior into a dangerous liability. "They're painting me as a ghost," Alyssa whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched the back of a leather chair until her knuckles turned white. "If I come forward now, I'm just a woman having a breakdown to cover a crime I didn't commit." Seo-jun remained seated, a monolithic presence of controlled, intimidating power. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at her, his dark eyes dissecting the fear that threatened to drown her. To him, this wasn't a tragedy. It was a tactical maneuver. The devils at the hospital were playing a game of shadows, and Alyssa was the only light they had left to extinguish. "This is how they kill you," Seo-jun said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. First, they take your name. Then, they take your mind. By the time they take your life, the world will thank them for it." He stood up, walking slowly toward her, his immaculate black suit a sharp contrast to her rumpled navy scrubs. He stopped just inches away, invading her personal space to force her gaze upward. He wasn't offering comfort. He was offering a choice. "You have no hospital to go back to, Alyssa. No home. No truth that the police will believe," he said, his face calm and emotionless. "You are a ghost in your own city." Alyssa felt the cold panic of the ER chase flooding her veins again, but she met his unreadable gaze with a desperate, burgeoning determination. She realized that the only way to haunt the men who had erased her was to stop being the victim and start being the witness they feared. "I'm not a ghost yet," she said, her voice gaining a sharp, jagged edge. "I still have the evidence. I still have the names." Seo-jun gave a microscopic nod, a signal of absolute control. The predator had finally found the steel spine he was looking for. The hospital board thought they had invalidated her testimony, but they had only ensured that the next time Alyssa Moore spoke, it would be with the backing of a man who didn't care about the law, only about results. The stillness of the fortress was shattered not by an alarm, but by the heavy, rhythmic thud of the service elevator and the smell of copper and salt. Alyssa was standing in the kitchen, her hands still clutching a glass of water, when the enforcers burst in, supporting a sagging, blood-soaked Seo-jun. The perfectly tailored black suit was no longer immaculate. It was torn and heavy with a warmth that Alyssa recognized with a jolt of professional instinct. "Ambush at the docks," the background man rasped, his eyes wide and intense, stripped of his usual anonymity. "He won't go to a hospital. They're watching every ER in the district." Alyssa's savior complex, the flaw that had led her into this cage, suddenly became her only weapon. The terrified fugitive vanished, replaced by the nurse who had spent a decade being the calm at the center of the storm. She directed them to lay him on the long mahogany table, her navy scrubs already catching the first stains of a new kind of war. "I need light, alcohol, and every first aid kit in this building," she commanded, her voice no longer a whisper, but a ringing authority. Seo-jun's face was a mask of stone, though his breath was coming in short, shallow hitches. Even as he bled out onto the table, his dark eyes remained lowered, unreadable, and focused on her. He was a monster, a predator who had offered her a safe house that was really a trial by fire, but in this moment, he was just a patient who was dying in the dark. The tools were primitive, bottles of high-end vodka for disinfectant, a sewing kit from the master suite, and industrial flashlights held by trembling enforcers. Alyssa worked with a desperate, surgical precision, her fingers moving with a grace that transcended the limited supplies. She had to retrieve a bullet lodged dangerously close to a major artery, the clink of metal against a silver tray, the only sound in the suffocating silence. "You should let me die," Seo-jun rasped, the words a low-frequency hum of skepticism and pain. "It would be the smartest thing you've ever done." Alyssa didn't blink. She tied off the final suture with a setting of bone in her spine, her expression a mix of exhaustion and fierce determination. She leaned over him, invading his personal space once more, but this time she wasn't asking for help. She was demanding his survival. "I don't do the smart thing, Seo-jun. I do the right thing," she whispered, her voice echoing his own cold, clinical tone back at him. "And right now, that means you stay alive to help me bury the men who did this." In the blue-hued shadows of the fortress, the power dynamic shifted. The nurse had saved the monster, and as Seo-jun's hand gripped her blood-stained sleeve, it wasn't a signal of control, but a microscopic acknowledgement of a debt. The following week, the fortress of glass and steel transformed from a sanctuary into a war room. Alyssa no longer wore the rumpled navy scrubs of a fugitive. She stood in the center of Seo-jun's high-tech command center, her silhouette sharp against the panoramic view of the harbor. The air was thick with the hum of servers and the clinical, cold energy of high-stakes logistics. Seo-jun sat in a high-backed leather chair, his face a mask of pale stone as he recovered from the surgery Alyssa had performed with a sewing kit and vodka. He watched her with a controlled, unreadable assessment as she navigated the digital manifests of his shipping empire. For the first time, he saw her not as a ghost or a burden, but as a strategic asset with a steel spine. "The hospital isn't just faking bills, Seo-jun," Alyssa said, her voice steady and ringing with a newfound authority. "They are using your gray zone shipping routes to move expired pacemakers and counterfeit antibiotics into the city." She pointed to a series of encrypted logs on the giant screen. To a dock worker, they looked like crates of textiles. To an ER nurse who had seen the jagged reality of medical failure, they were a roadmap to a massacre. She identified the black market signatures, discrepancies in temperature-controlled storage and weight variances that only a medical professional would notice. "They are using your ports as a graveyard for the city's health," she whispered, her eyes wide and intense as she looked at him. The room seemed to tilt as the realization hit. Seo-jun's logistics empire was being weaponized against the very people Alyssa had spent her life trying to save. The monsters she feared had been hiding in plain sight, riding on the back of the monster she had run to for help. Seo-jun leaned forward, the predator closing the distance. He didn't offer a platitude, he offered a weapon. "You found the breach in my wall, Alyssa. Now show me where to strike to ensure they never find their way back in." In that blue-hued cavern of secrets, Alyssa Moore finally broke through the glass ceiling of her own fear. She wasn't just a witness anymore, she was the architect of the syndicate's downfall. Then she had found her voice to speak for the victims, and for the first time, the man the city's enemies feared was listening to a nurse with the same intensity he gave to a king. The clinical silence of the war room was shattered by a single, high-frequency notification on Alyssa's personal phone, a grainy photo of her younger sister's apartment building, with a red X scrawled across the door. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins, threatening to dissolve the steel spine she had worked so hard to build. Dr. Sterling had stopped trying to erase her through the media. Now he was reaching into the only part of her world that was still real. "They're at my sister's," Alyssa whispered, her voice a broken serration in the quiet room. Seo-jun didn't flinch. He stood with a monolithic presence, in his eyes scanning the photo with the terrifyingly calm assessment of a man who lived in the heart of the storm. He didn't offer comfort, he offered a lesson in the architecture of violence. "Sterling is a surgeon," Seo-jun said, his voice dropping to a glacial chill. "He doesn't attack the heart first, he goes for the limbs to see how the heart reacts. If you run there now, you are stepping into a pre-operative trap." Alyssa gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white. Her savior complex screamed at her to go, but she saw the unreadable intensity in Seo-jun's lowered eyes and realized that the shy nurse who followed the rules was a dead woman. To save her family, she had to adopt the predator instinct of the man standing beside her. "Then we don't go to her," Alyssa said, her voice shaking but gaining a dangerous edge. "We go to what Sterling values most. We cut off his heir." Under Seo-jun's controlled guidance, Alyssa didn't send police to her sister's door. She sent a digital virus to Sterling's private offshore accounts, triggering an immediate high-stakes freeze on his liquidity. While the syndicate's kidnappers waited for Alyssa to show up at the apartment, Seo-jun's enforcers, moving with surgical precision, intercepted them, turning the ambush into a clinical sweep. The room seemed to tilt when the call came through. Her sister was safe and the cleaners were in Seo-jun's custody. Alyssa breathed out, a rush of adrenaline leaving her body like a tide. She looked at Seo-jun, who was standing completely still, his hands relaxed at his sides. He hadn't just saved her family. He had taught her that the only way to beat a monster was to outthink the beast. "You didn't blink, Alyssa," Seo-jun noted, his voice carrying a microscopic acknowledgement of respect. "I learned from the best," she replied, her chin rising. The nurse who asked for help was gone. In her place was a woman who understood that in this city, mercy was a luxury she would only afford once the devils were buried. returning to the halls of St. Jude's, felt like descending into a tomb that was still very much alive. The fluorescent lights didn't just buzz, they hissed, a clinical and predatory sound that seemed to recognize Alyssa even through the disguise of a janitorial uniform and a heavy, low-slung cap. Beside her, two of Seo-jun's enforcers moved with the silent, surgical precision of shadows, their anonymous presence a sharp contrast to the frantic energy of the night shift. The air in the hospital smelled of bleach and betrayal. Alyssa's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as they bypassed the primary elevators, using the service routes she had memorized during her years as a dedicated, invisible savior. Every time a nurse in navy scrubs walked past, Alyssa felt her breath hitch, the urge to shrink back into the shadows fighting against the steel spine she had found in the fortress of glass. "The records wing is sealed by an electronic override," Alyssa whispered, her voice a serrated edge in the quiet corridor. The enforcer behind her didn't speak. He simply stepped forward, his face a mask of stone as he deployed a bypass device provided by Seo-jun's technical team. The door clicked open with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the sterile silence. Inside, the room was a blue-hued cavern of filing cabinets and digital servers, the graveyard where the hospital board buried the truth of their black market sins. Alyssa moved with a desperate, frantic precision. She didn't go for the computers. She knew those had been scrubbed. She went for the physical manifests, the handwritten logs that Sterling's ego wouldn't allow him to destroy. Her fingers trembled as she found the ledger, the paper damp with the sweat of her own fear, as she realized it contained the names of every soul traded for profit. "I have it," she breathed, clutching the book to her chest like a miracle. But the room suddenly tilted as the red emergency lights began to pulse, a high-frequency alarm cutting through the silence. James Sterling had set a trap within the trial by fire. The doors locked, and through the glass partition, Alyssa saw the cleaners mobilizing, men whose eyes showed no panic, only the clinical intent to erase her. "Stay behind me," the enforcer commanded, his voice a low-frequency hum of authority as he drew a weapon. Alyssa didn't scream. She stood her ground, her chin rising as she looked at the monsters through the glass. She wasn't the girl who had run to a stranger in the hotel lobby anymore. She was the witness who held the receipt for their destruction. As the first blow struck the door, she realized that the truth didn't just float, it burned. The ballroom of the St. Jude's annual gala was a sea of shimmering silk and weaponized politeness, and a place where the city's elite gathered to toast to their own benevolence, while the rot festered beneath their feet. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the high-frequency hum of social climbing. Dr. Sterling stood at the center of the room, his face a mask of practiced clinical grace as he prepared to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award for a career built on a graveyard of secrets. The heavy brass doors didn't just open, they were cast wide as if the very atmosphere of the room had been split by a surgical strike. The music died, replaced by a suffocating silence as Seo-jun entered. He was a monolithic presence in an impeccable black suit, his controlled, intimidating gaze sweeping over the crowd like a predator evaluating a herd. Beside him, Alyssa Moore didn't shrink into the shadows. She wore a gown of midnight blue that echoed the color of her old scrubs, her chin high and her eyes wide with a fierce, unyielding determination. "The guest list for this evening seems to be missing the most important witnesses," Seo-jun said, his voice smooth, low, and carrying to every corner of the silent hall. Sterling's smile shattered, his eyes turning weaponized and cold as he recognized the nurse he had tried to erase. "This is a private event, Seo-jun. Nurse Moore is a fugitive in the middle of a mental breakdown. Security, remove them." But the security team didn't move. They stood with the stillness of men who understood that absolute power had just walked through the door. Alyssa stepped forward, her fingers steady as she held up the physical manifest she had retrieved from the fire. She didn't look at Sterling with fear. She looked at him with the clinical assessment of a woman who had already diagnosed his terminal greed. "The only mental breakdown here is yours, doctor," Alyssa said, her voice ringing with the authority of the truth. This ledger contains the serial numbers of the expired pacemakers you diverted through the docks and the names of the patients who paid for them with their lives. On the giant projection screens behind the podium, the digital logs Seo Jun's team had decrypted began to scroll, a blue-hued waterfall of evidence that drowned the room in the syndicate's sins. The elite shifted, their respect evaporating as the clinical reality of the fraud was laid bare. Seo Jun placed a hand on Alyssa's shoulder, a public declaration of protection that signaled the end of the old order. "You assumed she was a ghost you could haunt," Seo Jun said to Sterling, his voice dropping to a glacial chill, "but she is the only thing in this room that is real." As the first sirens of the actual authorities began to wail outside, Alyssa didn't run. She stood her ground, no longer a fugitive in rumpled scrubs, but the architect of a new kind of justice. The predator had shielded her, but the nurse had performed the final execution. The blue-hued silence that followed the dismantling of St. Jude's was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of a grave, but the crisp, expectant stillness of a city finally drawing a clean breath. Outside the high-tech fortress of glass and steel, the rain washed over the pavement, no longer trying to erase Alyssa Moore, but rinsing away the grit of the syndicate's decade-long sins. The monsters who had bartered in expired pacemakers and counterfeit lives were gone, excavated from their seats of power by the ledger Alyssa had carried through the fire. 3 months later, Alyssa stood in the center of a panoramic boardroom that sat at the apex of the city's newest medical landmark. She no longer wore the navy medical scrubs that were damp with the sweat of a woman who had seen too much. Today, she was dressed in a suit of charcoal gray, its lines as sharp and tailored as the man who had recognized the steel spine beneath her professional modesty. She was no longer a fugitive or a ghost of a nurse. She was the executive director of the Seo Medical Foundation, a legitimate healthcare empire born from the ruins of corruption. Every employee who walked past her moved with a rhythm of profound respect. They didn't look for weaknesses to exploit or behaviors to label as mentally unstable. Instead, they looked for a nod of acknowledgement from the woman who had performed surgery under fire and survived a hunt by devils. Alyssa had found her voice, transforming her savior complex from a flaw that left her cornered into a weapon that protected the city's most vulnerable. Seo Jun stepped out from the shadows of the adjacent office, his presence still a monolithic weight of controlled, intimidating power. The faint cut on his cheek was a fading map of the night she had saved his life, a microscopic reminder of the debt he would never fully repay. He walked toward her, not as a predator closing the distance on prey, but as a man meeting his match. He handed her a set of keys, not to a safe house, more but to the new hospital wing she had designed to heal the system that tried to break her. "The board of investors is waiting," Seo Jun said, his voice a low-frequency hum of genuine, guarded hope. "They are still a bit high-strung about the transparency reports you demanded." Alyssa took the keys, the weight of them a solid, grounding reality against her palm. She looked at him, her eyes wide and intense, but no longer filled with the panic of the hotel lobby. "Let them wait," she replied, her voice ringing with the authority of someone who had nothing left to fear. "I want to make sure the patient intake protocols are correct first." She looked out at the grid of diamonds beneath her, seeing a city that was finally safe under her watch. She had started as a shadow in rumpled scrubs, a nurse who ran to a stranger for help, but she had woken up a giant. As they walked together into the boardroom, the transition was complete. She was no longer just his protégé. She was his equal, the moral compass in a world that had forgotten how to feel.